Well, hey again, Grace family. I wanted to take a few moments to kind of revisit what I talked about in my message this weekend and hopefully give you some opportunities to have some further discussion. I had a couple extra thoughts I wanted to share and some things to think about as you work with your group to discuss what exactly self-giving love looks like for us today. So just in case you missed the message, what I was essentially talking about was how Isaiah 58, one of the books in the Old Testament, how Isaiah 58 paints the picture of a difference between self-interest and what I call self-giving love. It paints the picture of a people trying to get God to act by going through all the religious motions, but then not hearing from him and God not acting for them because ultimately, even though they were doing all the right religious stuff, their hearts were not aligned. They were acting selfishly. They were oppressing people. They were spreading violence and chaos, all this stuff that's exactly the opposite of what God intends. Instead, the prophet encourages the people to give of themselves, to care for the marginalized, to look after the vulnerable, to protect those who are oppressed, and goes through this long list of how when we do that, when we give ourselves on behalf of other people, that's when we start to experience the healing of God. And I pointed out the fact that the reason that happens is because when we're doing those things, we are jumping in and joining God in the work that he's already doing. God is already giving of himself in self-giving love. He's already protecting the vulnerable. And so when we do that, we're joining with him. We're standing shoulder to shoulder with him. And as a result, we begin to experience the healing and the life and the light that comes from him because we are so close to him. I love the verse in verse 9. It says, when we do all of those things, when we begin to act with self-giving love, then when you call, the Lord will answer, yes, I am here, he will reply. I think that's so cool because it's like, okay, God is right here. He doesn't have to shout to us. He's right there with us because this is exactly the kind of work that he does. So I boiled it all down. If you wanted to have a big idea, that is kind of the big idea for the whole message, it's just this. The path to restoration comes not through self-interest, but through self-giving love. And of course, I introduced a few ideas for what that might look like in the midst of this coronavirus pandemic. Accepting a bit of discomfort and inconvenience for the sake of the vulnerable, taking social distancing seriously, wearing masks, not because they protect us, but because they protect those who are immunocompromised or older or all of that. Number two, I talked about stopping the hate train, saying that if we want to give of ourselves in self-giving love, then we need to stand up against hate and never participate in it. And finally, I talked about the fact that if we want to give of ourselves in self-giving love, then generosity probably needs to be the way that we approach our world. Not just generosity with money, but generosity with our time, with our privacy, generosity to try to draw other people around us into the healing embrace of God. So, I'm sure there's plenty for you guys to debate and discuss about that. I would love to hear, actually, if you guys have time in your groups to talk about this, what of those ideas are most uncomfortable for you? Or what do you find it's difficult to wrap your mind around? Do you actually push back on anything that I said? I'd love for you guys to discuss those things because I know this is controversial and things like wearing masks are starting to get politicized and it's crazy. So take some time, go there with each other and see if you guys can come to a point of agreement of what does it look like for your group and you, your family, and you as an individual to give of yourself in self-giving love. A couple things I wanted to just discuss that kind of came out of this passage. I mentioned, first of all, that there are three, I may have mentioned three, but there are sections in Isaiah that cover different portions of the experience of the people of Israel. And if you look at chapters 55 through 66, it's all about Israel in the wake of the Babylonian exile, trying to rebuild. But if you look at chapters 40 through 54, all of those prophecies were specifically geared towards the Israelites who were in the midst of exile in Babylon. And in August, we are going to take an entire sermon series. We're going to take 5 weeks and dig dig deeply into that second portion of Isaiah, all about the people's experience in Babylon. I think it's going to be a really, really deep and important series for us, and I think it's going to be very, very timely, regardless of what our world looks like in just a few months. So look forward to that, and we're gonna do our best to keep doing things like this with the sermon discussion guides and all of that. Okay, a couple other things I wanted to share with you. First of all, I know that some of you probably, when you heard me talking about the fact that when we act or when we give of ourselves, self-giving love, then we receive abundance from God. And it probably made you think, wait a second, is that health and wealth? Are you talking about, you give money to the church and then you're going to get a bunch of money in return? No, categorically no, that's not what I'm talking about. What I mean when I talk about giving of yourself and receiving God's abundance is that when we are sacrificial in the way that we act towards our world, when we have self-giving love as our sort of modus operandi, then we begin to experience the abundance of God. Now, that may not mean that we have our own material needs, overflowing. We may not have overflowing bank accounts, but what we will find is just what Isaiah 58 talks about. We will find strength for the journey. We'll find nourishment in our souls. We'll find endurance to keep us going. That's the kind of abundance that we start to find. When God's presence comes near us, we find courage, we find strength. It's not necessarily material, but what it is, equips us in ways that we may not have had before. Finally, I just wanted to give you a passage that I would love for you guys to take a look at as a group if you want to discuss this further, and it's Philippians 2. Now, you hear me talk about Philippians 2 all the time, and in fact, this may have been where I first started talking about self-giving love. But in Philippians 2, Paul is urging the church in Philippi to have the same attitude as Christ Jesus. And then he goes into this beautiful poem about how Christ, Jesus, even though he was God, he didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped or hung onto, but he made himself a servant. He made himself nothing. He had self-giving love, and he actually went and died on a cross for the sake of others. That's the attitude that we are supposed to have. So take a look at Philippians 2 as a group and just see what comes out of that discussion. Because when we want to understand self-giving love, there is no better model than the person of Jesus Christ. So there's some stuff for you to think about, to have some further discussions on, and I would love to hear your feedback as we continue doing our best to be a church that rises to the occasion in love and compassion for the people of our world. Love you guys, and we'll see you around soon.